Trump's promises of replacing a deep state.
So what Trump is actually doing is he is cutting down all the fat and he's turning it into a really lean, mean fighting machine. And that's going to make the US even more powerful. The US is now more of a technocratic nation. It's being run by technocrats. You have Elon Musk and probably the second most powerful man in the US today after Donald Trump.
Great powers fight proxy wars when their interests clash. Great powers reset ties when their interests align. The pawns and proxies suffer.
Both can't be true. Either Russia has failed in Ukraine and they have not been able to take Ukraine.
Now, is that in line for a vice president to sort of go and say that?
Zelensky is the head of state of Ukraine. There was this interaction between Zelensky and Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in front of the media. About the 35-40 minute mark, it just went south. The Americans have already taken over the Panama Canal. It was sold to BlackRock just a couple of days ago.
It was?
Yes, it was. That's why the Chinese embassy has put up the statement that we are willing to fight to the end. Okay, they have the biggest navy in the world in terms of numbers. The threshold, the barrier to attacking a nation like the US from the ocean is much lower now. So it's possible.
Right when the world needs you, you're here. Abhijit, welcome to Dostcast again.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to be back.
Last time we met, the world was in a different time. I remember our conversation around Bangladesh upset many Bangladeshis.
I see.
Because you pointed out some very obvious facts that they wanted to deny because they were under the influence of, narrative control from the US. Mm-hmm. Ever since then, Trump and Modi have both met in America once.
Yes.
And Trump himself said, Bangladesh is Modi's department. I'm not going to interfere. My first question is, and this is more a suspicion that's emerging now on Twitter, that Trump's promises of replacing a deep state and eradicating a deep state are actually just him replacing the old deep state with his own new deep state. What do you think about that?
Yes, great question. The great topic to start with. So Trump made this part of his election promise that he's going to cut down on the deep state, eradicate the deep state. His first presidency was also one on the platform, on the plank of draining the swamp in Washington D.C., mm-hmm. which is the bureaucracy and all that. So the question is, how do we define the deep state? How does Trump define deep state? And he seems to define the deep state as this excessively large bureaucracy that the US government is saddled with, and he wants to cut all of that down, remove all the inefficiencies. That's what DOGE is doing, the mm-hmm. Department of Governmental Efficiency. So the deep state, from my perspective, is something different. It's not merely the bureaucracy. Sure, if you look at the State Department in the US, if you look at the Pentagon, there are these carrier bureaucrats, carrier officials who are unelected and who will be there no matter who's the president. Mm-hmm. And they, to a large extent, call the shots. So some of that will be cut down. Some of that fat will be trimmed. But from my perspective, the deep state of the US is this unelected power center that is not necessarily at the bureaucratic level, but much higher, mm-hmm. maybe even higher than the president. A small number of extremely powerful, shadowy figures who may be out there in the public domain or may not be. And they are the ones who really control everything, including the US president. So that's how I see the deep state. It's something that's transnational. It's not limited just to the US. It's limited. It holds power across much of the world. That's how I see the deep state. So what Trump is actually doing is he is cutting down all the fat. He's in the process of doing that. All the excess flab that the government has, and he's turning it into a really lean, mean fighting machine. And that's going to make the US even more powerful. But it's not really, he's not really going after the true power. You know, the individuals who have been controlling US presidents for decades. I think we have seen, it starts probably in the 1950s and 1960s when someone like JFK, John F. Kennedy, when he tried to go after the power that the three-letter agencies have, he got assassinated and so on. So I don't think Trump is going after that. There are certain nations that he will not go after. Okay, For example, Israel, he's not going to do anything against Israel. Since he became president, Netanyahu seems, you can see that he's visibly more confident, and he's visibly now relaxed into his position. Before Trump became president, Netanyahu's position was very unstable. It was on shaky ground. There are corruption cases against him, but I think he is much more secure now. So Trump is completely transforming the way the US is being run. Like we mentioned just a while ago off camera, the US is now more of a technocratic nation. It's being run by technocrats. You have Elon Musk, who is who's the world's richest man, and probably the second most powerful man in the US today after Donald Trump. There's Trump himself, who's not a career politician. He's a businessman. He knows how to negotiate, the art of the deal. He's very transactional. He's taking it into geopolitics and so on. So the US, see, this is the age of technology. This is the age of AI. There's so much happening behind closed doors that we are not aware of. We think that the best AI systems we have today are the Chat GPT 4.5 or whatever, Cloud 3.7. There are AI systems behind closed doors that probably have achieved AGI status, human 130 level IQ, or maybe even ASI, artificial superintelligence level. We don't know. It's not going to be revealed to the public. It's going to remain under wraps. So the US is on the verge of becoming a tremendously powerful nation through AI, through the breakthroughs it's achieving in AI. It may become a hyperpower, and it's on the verge of becoming a space colonizing power once they reach Mars before the end of the 2020s. So there's a complete transformation in the way they see the world and geopolitics. The rest of the world is still stuck in the 20th century or early 21st century mindset. That's where Europe is stuck. They're still stuck in their old imaginary era where the Europeans were the primary power in the world. They are not. And that's why there is so much pushback against Trump, which will not last for too long. I am no fan of anybody. I am not a fanboy of Trump or a fanboy of Putin. I just see the world from this perspective, from a purely hard power perspective. And the way I see it, the US is on the verge of pivoting from being a superpower to a hyperpower. And for that, they need to change the way things are done, the way international relations are run. When Prime Minister Modi visited Washington recently, it was a very cordial meeting, nothing like what happened with Zelensky. Right? It was a very cordial meeting. It went very well. And when the two leaders were fielding media questions, there was a question that was asked about Bangladesh. And Trump said that I will leave Bangladesh to Mr. Modi. And this response by Trump has been interpreted in a number of ways. Some Indian news channel presenters have interpreted it to mean that Trump is leaving the nation of Bangladesh to India. And India will decide what happens there. The way I see it, Trump merely deflected the question. He doesn't really mean that he's going to leave Bangladesh to India. What he meant was, I will leave the question that you've asked to Mr. Modi.
Sure.
That's how I see it.
And people are basing their commentary and future predictions based on one statement, that there's going to be substantial policy change in Bangladesh. That's what you're saying.
Yes. And let me explain why I think it is the case. So the US has proxies around the world. We could call it proxy states, client states, vassal states, whatever you want to call it. In the Indian subcontinent, the US has two major vassals proxies. One is East Pakistan, one is West Pakistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan. In West Pakistan, west of India, they effected a regime change in 2022, just a couple of months after the Russian special military operation in Ukraine. And what the Americans did was they ousted Imran Khan, who was then the prime minister, and he was a very pro-China prime minister. They ousted him through a classic regime change operation, and whoever, they placed somebody else in power. I think it was Shehbaz Sharif.
Shehbaz Sharif, yeah.
Yes. And Shehbaz Sharif is a US client, and his government is a US client, and the Pakistan military is the real power that runs the country, and they are on the side of the US now. So Pakistan is a full-fledged US client once again. Now, last year, they effected a similar regime change operation in Bangladesh. It is said that it was done by the students. The student protests were the visual cover that you need for the real regime change, which was done by the military. Sheikh Hasina left only when the military gave her 45 minutes to leave the country. She didn't leave before that. She got the ultimatum from the real power, which is the military. And that's why she left. And today you have a puppet called Mohammed Yunus.
No, please call him a Nobel laureate.
A Nobel laureate.
Give him the respect he deserves.
Indeed, he deserves respect because he's a Nobel laureate. So Mr. Mohammed Yunus, Nobel laureate, is now the face of the regime that currently runs Bangladesh, and it's once again a US proxy regime. So the US has established two proxies on either side of India. When they have that sort of leverage over a large nation like India, why would they give it up? Does it make any sense to give up the leverage you've built, you've earned by creating by running a full-fledged, complicated regime change operation? You would never give that up. So I don't think Trump is gonna give that leverage over India up. If you have leverage over a nation, you can make the nation do all kinds of things. You can make the nation comply with your demands.
Sure.
So I don't think Bangladesh is being handed over to Mr. Modi or to India. It was simply Trump deflecting a question and making it sound like, open to interpretation.
Sure.
So I don't think the US is going to leave Bangladesh to India. They're going to run the show in Bangladesh for sure.
अगर आपको दोस्तकास्ट पसंद है और आप अक्सर यूट्यूब पे देखते हैं इस पॉडकास्ट को, तो स्पॉटिफाई पे दोस्तकास्ट को जरूर चेक करना. वहां पे हम अनरिलीज एपिसोड्स निकालते हैं, बेस्ट ऑफ दोस्तकास्ट निकालते हैं और भी बहुत कुछ. लिंक डिस्क्रिप्शन में है.
Talking about Bangladesh and in the similar vein, talking about Ukraine, I have a little quote from today's newspaper, and people should know I'm reading newspapers now, so I'm a little more informed. Great powers fight proxy wars when their interests clash. Great powers reset ties when their interests align. The pawns and proxies suffer.
Indeed.
Right? Now, everyone knows that generally presidents are replaced, even in America and even in India, prime ministers are replaced time after time when you fight elections, but foreign policies largely remain the same, right?
In the US, the foreign policy doesn't really change. In India, it can take a complete 180-degree turn depending on which government is in power, which prime minister is in power. For example, I'll tell you what, we've had prime ministers in India who have completely reversed long-standing policy. For example, it is said that when Prime Minister Morarji Desai became Prime Minister, he undid decades of Indian intelligence operations in Pakistan and revealed the identities, allegedly, of the Indian intelligence assets in Pakistan. And they were all rounded up by Ziaul Haq and dealt with. And it is also said that when Prime Minister I.K. Gujral came to power in India, just for 3 months, he did the same thing once again. So in India, it's not that the case that the policy remains the same, foreign policy remains the same. In India, the foreign policy fluctuates wildly depending on who's on power. In the US, foreign policy never changes. It doesn't matter who is in power, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat or whoever. The large-scale, big-picture, macro foreign policy never changes. The US is a very interesting nation. Look, it's a two-party system, right? You have the Democrats and Republicans. You have a couple of other parties, the Greens and whatever, but they don't really matter. So it's a de facto two-party state, which is just one step above a one-party regime like China or North Korea. And both parties have essentially the same, very similar foreign policy.
Sure.
Right now, you're seeing a big transformation of foreign policy, but it is not affecting the US national interest in any way adversely.
If I were to ask simplistically, how is foreign policy similar between Democrats and Republicans? Because wouldn't a Democrat be more sort of okay for more immigration or, aiding more money operations outside, sending foreign aid, and a Republican would be more conservative because that is the nature of a Republican?
Yes. So Republicans are generally more conservative. The Democrats are more liberal. When it comes to immigration policies into the US, it's more like a domestic policy. And that's been disastrous for the US. What the Democrats did the last 4 years, they opened the southern border, the Texas border, and they allowed God knows how many millions of illegal immigrants to flow into the country. The government was aiding and abetting illegal immigration. Can you believe it? That's a definition, classic definition, textbook definition of corruption. And when it comes to the the Biden regime's foreign policy, it was, I would say, counterproductive to the US to a large extent, because you have all this instability in Ukraine, instability in the Middle East. They could have done a better job of this. So what Trump is doing, he's resetting all this. So he is not aligning with Russia like some people allege. He's not working against Europe. He's simply working towards making US power the US more powerful. And he's resetting the global geopolitical landscape to favor the US in the long run. So if it means you you sacrifice Western Europe, you sacrifice the NATO nations, EU nations, and their economies, it doesn't matter. See, for a very long time, you've seen that Europe has been treated like royalty. Ever since the Second World War ended, you had a situation where the US was the primary power in Western Europe. And the Western European nations, the EU and NATO nations, their economies were to a large extent subsidized by the US. The US paid for much of the NATO upkeep expenditure, all of that. They guaranteed security for all these nations by physically occupying some of them, like Germany, Italy, etc. And because of this, the European nations were able to transform their economies into welfare states.
Sure.
Spending a lot on welfare and all that, micromanaging the economy, spending a lot on social security and stuff like that.
Right.
If you don't have a job, you will be guaranteed a certain amount of money per week or per month from the government, that sort of thing. So everybody was well taken care of. It was not a Darwinian meritocratic system. It was a rather coddled sort of thing.
Yeah, which is often labeled as, oh wow, look at the Scandinavian success story where society has reached, right? That's how they say it.
Yeah. So if a government is on its own, it would not be able to afford to spend that much on social security and welfare and things like that. It would say, okay, we can have a basic kind of arrangement where you have something called the poverty line. If you're below the poverty line, we'll help you out. Otherwise, you are on your own and do your best, that sort of thing. So that's the direction in which Trump is pushing Europe towards right now. And that's why all the EU nations are upset with him. They are used to be treated like royalty. The EU leaders are essentially bureaucrats. They don't really represent their people. They take decisions and they enact policies and implement policies that are extremely unpopular, but there's nothing the people can do.
No, but even after being elected by the popular vote, wouldn't that be a representation of the people?
I'll tell you what. In Europe, policy, you have people who are apparently elected by popular vote. Okay. But what happens is that they don't really have any control or any power on what policies to frame and implement. The decisions are made from Brussels. Brussels is the headquarters of the EU. You have Ursula von der Leyen, who's currently the boss, so to say. And it's Brussels that decides what policies will be implemented across the EU. The EU nations are not sovereign. Let me explain why I say they're not sovereign. For a nation to be sovereign, what are the conditions that need to be met? First of all, you need to have your own currency so that you control your economy. Secondly, you need to have control over your borders. And thirdly, you need to have control over the laws that you can enact and implement. In the EU nations, there's no control the nations have over their borders and who can come in and go out. Secondly, they don't have their own currency. They have the euro, which is nothing but a rebranded Deutschmark. And thirdly, the policies are decided from Brussels. And fourthly, you need to be able to have full control over your military, which again is not the case in Europe.
No, but I remember we met at one of the hotels in Delhi a year ago, and you said that France and Germany are almost sovereign in the way that they have their own military.
Okay, so I spoke about France. Germany is not sovereign by any means at all because it is under physical military occupation by the US. The Americans have military bases in Germany which have been occupied by the Americans since 1945. So Germany is actually under military occupation. Their constitution was written under US supervision. When it comes to France, it's a different story. If you look at the French military, all of their aircraft are French made. If you look at their submarines, the Scorpions are all French made. If you look at their aircraft carrier, it's made by the French. If you look at their nuclear deterrent, it's French made on French missiles. If you look at other nations that are nuclear powers like the UK, they have technically a nuclear deterrent, but their nuclear warheads are mated to American missiles. So the big red button isn't in London, it's in Washington, D.C.
Right.
So France is a quasi-sovereign nation. Among all the EU nations, all the NATO nations, it has the most amount of sovereignty. And that's why Mr. Macron is at the forefront of all that's happening right now.
Right. He's one of the only world leaders that you see most in the press when you talk about the EU. And often as a representative of the EU, like a soft representative.
Yes. And also you can see that when Mr. Macron deals with Mr. Trump, he is much more assertive than any other EU leader. You can see that he sometimes pushes back against Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump allows that because he respects the fact that France has a limited amount of sovereignty, which the other EU nations simply don't have.
It's so funny how military might, even tiny amounts, can change what you bring to the negotiation table.
Absolutely. And that's why India is respected, because we have our own nuclear deterrent, our own missiles, we have our own currency, our own economy. We have problems of various kinds in India, but we are still a genuinely sovereign nation. I would say
Right.
there are only 4 genuinely sovereign nations in the world. That's the US, Russia, China, and India. And the other nations have limited sovereignty, not completely sovereign, including France, etc. If you look at Australia, it's like a US-owned corporation and so on.
So tell me about the new world order and its allies. For example, I'll start with the Zelensky issue that really made the memes and made the news and has been making it for almost a week after it happened.
Yeah.
That infamous shouting match inside the Oval Office where Zelensky is visibly upset and is standoffish with the president and the vice president. And then JD Vance says you should be thankful. And that kind of, many people said that kind of standoffishness is best for closed doors where you can be hard. What do you think that is a symptom of? Is that the US saying, look, you are basically someone we own, so respect us or leave? Or does the US actually benefit from directly aligning with Russia? I know earlier you said that it's not really like that, but in terms of the new world order, who will the US ally with and where will the power centers form? And who's in opposition?
Yeah, great question. So, what happened in Washington, D.C., at the White House, was unprecedented. It's never happened before. That sort of shouting match between two leaders of two nations, especially the US president and somebody else, it's never happened. And you are absolutely right in saying that this should have happened behind closed doors. See, diplomacy that happens behind closed doors is very different from diplomacy that happens in front of the cameras.
Right.
Behind closed doors, there's no, it's not nice. It's outright bullying. There's arm twisting. There's threats. All of that. But it happens behind closed doors. Once you're outside that, and once the cameras are on, you put on a show, a pretense of everything being civilized and very diplomatic. So what happened in Washington, D.C. with Zelensky was the opposite of that. So let's unpack what happened. There was this interaction between Zelensky and Trump and the Vice President JD Vance in front of the media. And Zelensky came with a bunch of people and so on. And it's about a 45-minute interaction. So the first 35 minutes, everything goes fine. And Zelensky is trying to push back against Trump, saying that he needs guarantees and so on. And at some point in time, about the 35-40-minute mark, it just went south because JD Vance reminded Zelensky that you need to be grateful to us. You need to be thankful. Have you said
Now, is that in line for a vice president to sort of go and say that?
So it happened because Zelensky was the one pushing. See, let's understand something. Zelensky is the head of state of Ukraine. Ukraine is a nation that is under Russian invasion, let's say, an occupation. Now, we have to go back in time to understand what really the situation is like. Before 2014, Ukraine had a constitutionally elected government. And that government was toppled in US regime change operation during the Euromaidan coup. And I'm not making some absurd claim. Joe Biden is on record saying that we undid the government in Ukraine. And when the Euromaidan revolution, the coup was happening, you had people like Victoria Nuland, etc., who were on the ground in Ukraine, and they were kind of coordinating the protesters. So it's clearly a classic US regime change operation in which the democratically and constitutionally elected government of Ukraine was ousted and a puppet government was put in place. And then eventually Mr. Zelensky, I think in 2019, he becomes the president of Ukraine. So Zelensky is a US asset. He was a comedian. He spent a large part of his career as a comedian working out of Moscow. Okay. And so on. So that's the thing. So Zelensky is a US asset. Okay. Now the Russian invasion happens in 2022. They call it a special military operation because they're not doing a full-fledged war against the infrastructure and all that. They just want they want certain objectives in Russia, in Ukraine. They want a denazification of Ukraine, demilitarization of Ukraine, and the guarantee that Ukraine will never become a NATO
What
nation.
denazification?
Denazification.
There's Nazis in Ukraine?
Oh, absolutely.
But there's Jews in Ukraine.
Isn't that strange? Isn't that fascinating that Zelensky is a Jewish person, and yet Ukraine has a very strongly Nazi element in its military and its population. Going back to the days of Bandera in the Second World War, when there were pogroms against the Jews in Lviv and other cities in Ukraine, led by a Nazi Ukrainian called Bandera. Okay, and even today, Bandera is worshipped as a hero in Ukraine. And there was this entire Ukrainian military regiment called the Azov regiment that had the Hakenkreuz, the Nazi hooked cross, and other Nazi insignia, and they were openly Nazis. So Ukraine has a very strong Nazi history that people may not be aware about. So Putin's objectives were to demilitarize Ukraine, denazify Ukraine, and ensure that Ukraine becomes a neutral nation and never becomes a part of NATO. These were the objectives of the special military operation.
Sure.
Okay, so the special military operation starts, and Ukraine would have crumbled in 2 weeks or 3 days or whatever they say, if the West, which means the US and NATO, had not continuously supplied it with arms and ammunition. The US itself has spent more than $350-400 billion in supplying Ukraine with whatever it needs to stay afloat. And yet what we have seen in Ukraine is a complete disintegration of society. All the young men are dead. Now they are recruiting 50, 60-year-old men and even pregnant women into the fighting machine, into the military. Many of them are dragged out against their will and inducted into the armed forces. And J.D. Vance mentioned that. Okay. So Ukraine is a disaster, and it is still fighting only because the West is propping it up. The moment the West stops supplying Ukraine with whatever, it's simply not going to be able to fight. Where does the inexhaustible, limitless supply of ammunition and weapons come from? It comes from the West, from NATO, from the US. So now Trump is ending that. Okay, so the thing about Zelensky is that the West, the past 3 years, they have, the media especially, and the various EU governments, they have lionized him. They have portrayed him as this great fighter, this small Goliath, this small David against mighty Putin Goliath.
Right, like he's been on the cover of so many magazines.
Vogue magazine. In the middle of an invasion, of a war, he and his wife pose on the front cover of Vogue magazine.
Yeah.
Like a fashion shoot. You're fighting a war, right? Why don't you go fight a war instead of posing for Vogue?
And then deliberately, like, it's so funny, Putin never changes his official dress. He's always in his standard suit and tie.
Yes.
But Zelensky deliberately wears the camouflage, the camos, to show that it's a state of war and I'm now so involved in it that I don't even have the time to be in official attire.
So he's an actor, he's a performer, he's a comedian. He knows the power that these non-verbal cues have, the costume, the dress that you wear and so on. The point is this. Look, what's in the best interest of Ukraine? If you look back at history, the past 1,000 years, you will see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are the same people. Okay, the Rus people, their origin is the Kievan Rus, which goes back 1,000 years roughly. Okay, I'm just making a very long story short.
Sure.
And the original capital of the Kievan Rus people was Kiev. Long before Moscow existed, the capital of the Rus, the Russian people, was Kiev. And then there was the Mongol invasion and occupation of Russia, after which it was called the Mongol yoke. And eventually when the Rus people threw off the Mongol yoke after a century and a half or so, that's when Moscow became the dominant center of gravity for the Rus people. And then the region that's called Ukraine was called Ukraina. Ukraina means the borderlands. The borderlands of what? Of the Russian people, right? So the Ukrainians have never really been a separate people. Ukrainian, the language is like a dialect. It's like the difference between Hindi and Bhojpuri or something.
Sure.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And during the USSR era, Ukraine was part of Russia and so on. So that's the deal. And NATO in 1991 or wherever, it had given Russia a verbal assurance that they would not expand eastwards if Russia allowed the reunification of East and West Germany. And the moment this happens, NATO breaks the promise because Russia is weak and you have Boris Yeltsin, who was a Western asset in power. So they started expanding westwards. And in 2014, when the regime change operation happened in Ukraine, it was clear to Putin that too much time has gone. And now Ukraine itself, right at Russia's border, could become a NATO nation.
Sure.
And you could have American weapons and missiles right at the doorstep of Russia. And that was a red line that Putin could not allow anyone to cross. And that's why this special military operation happened, which is not really a full-fledged war. In 2014, he took Crimea, and now Ukraine has happened. And Ukraine has been completely devastated as a consequence of the war. Now, if you are the leader of Ukraine, what is your national interest? First of all, to stop the bloodbath. Your demography is being destroyed. The flower of your nation, the youth, are being massacred in the trenches against the Russians. And Russians are also dying and so on. You need to stop this. What's the point of being a puppet of a faraway foreign power when you are simply a disposable asset? The Americans, the Biden regime intended to fight the Ukraine war as long as the last Ukrainian was alive. Fight to the last Ukrainian. Yeah. And then throw away Ukraine, and then we'll look at Russia later.
It's a proxy war.
It's a proxy war. It's a classic proxy war scenario. And the objective was to weaken Russia, which has backfired. Russia has become stronger. Yeah. Because Russia typically in a war, the initial phase of a war, whenever Russia is involved historically, it doesn't do too well. But as the war progresses, Russia becomes more and more powerful. Historically, you've seen this happen over and over again.
Right. Initially, they took one oblast. Now they've taken about 20% of Ukraine's territories.
Yeah, roughly 20% of Ukraine's territories have been taken by Russia. Actually, in the initial phase of the war, their column of tanks and weapon and armored vehicles had reached the doorstep of Kiev, actually. And then they brought it back. Because there was some agreement that was going to be signed, and which was scuttled at the last moment, allegedly by Boris Johnson of the UK, and so on. So a lot of water has flown under the bridge. But the point is, your national interest lies in having a ceasefire as soon as possible. End the war that should never have happened. Don't allow your nation to be used as a proxy for a faraway power. Your people and the Russian people are essentially the same people. Why don't you arrive at a settlement, a compromise with Russia, and end the war? Mm-hmm. So the European nations, they want this war to continue. You can see Monsieur Macron of France is saying that there can be no ceasefire and there can be no agreement with Russia. And the various European nations want the war to continue. Trump wants the war to end. It's a waste of money, of US money. It's a waste of US energy. He wants to focus on Russia and the Indo-Pacific and all that.
Sure.
So he is concerned about his national interest. He's not trying to align with Putin. Putin also wants the war to end. It's a pointless war. It's also, of course, it's made his country stronger, paradoxically, despite the sanctions and all that. But it is kind of pushing Russia in a dangerous situation with China, where it becomes over-reliant on China. And that's not good for Russia either. So there's this complicated scenario right now. The best thing for the whole world, and for Ukraine, and for Russia, and for Europe, is for the war to end. See, one of two things is true. Both can't be true. Either Russia has failed in Ukraine and they have not been able to take Ukraine. Uh-huh. Either that is true, or the other scenario that that Europe is in danger of Russia overrunning Europe. That's true. Which one is true? Is Russia so dangerous that the whole of Europe is in danger? Or is it true that Russia has failed in Ukraine? I think Russia has deliberately ensured that it doesn't destroy Ukraine. Putin could have flattened Ukraine with missiles, with fighter aircraft, whatever.
He's sheathed his power.
Yes, because he doesn't want to destroy Ukraine. He doesn't want to destroy the infrastructure, the people. He doesn't want to... he doesn't see the Ukrainians as an enemy people, right? He has tried his best to be restrained, one would say. And then people will now accuse me of being a Putin apologist. I have no horse in this race. I see things from my perspective, the Indian perspective. Sure. But that's the deal. So... Zelensky has been lionized by the West, and that's why he has this huge overinflated ego. Wherever he goes in the EU, he's received like royalty by various heads of state and all. And then he goes with that huge ego to Washington, and he doesn't get what he wants. And to me, it looked like he was perhaps goaded by the Europeans before he reached Washington to make these demands. So he came to Washington and he was asking for security guarantees. Bro, you're alive because of the West. You've been able to stay afloat for 3 years because of US support, hundreds of billions of dollars, and you have no leverage over the US. And you come to the White House and demand security assurances and guarantees. Who the hell are you to do that?
So then my question is Zelensky a US asset gone rogue now in bed with the Europeans?
Precisely. He's no longer a US asset. Okay, now he's trying to fight his own war. He's still... as long as the war goes on, he is secure. The moment there's a ceasefire, the question arises, what happens to Zelensky? Because he is not in power as an elected president anymore. There should have been an election in Ukraine last year. Okay, in May or June or whatever.
But martial law has been declared, so that's...
Martial law has been declared, so technically he's fine. But the moment the ceasefire happens, let's say a ceasefire happens, the US and Russia decide that we're going to have a ceasefire without involving the Europeans or the Ukrainians. Which means that that the Americans stop sending arms, ammunition, money, etc. to Ukraine.
And they immediately after the conference, all the NATO leaders gathered in one place and do this big group photograph. No, we will look into this matter.
But the question is, do they have the resources to keep Ukraine afloat? They have neither the money, nor the arms, nor the ammunition to keep Ukraine afloat. And that's why Zelensky has now made a U-turn. Just yesterday or day before, he put out a tweet saying that what happened in Washington could have been done better. And I'm still willing to sign the mineral deal agreement with the US and so on.
And why would the US, grab Ukraine by the proverbial testicles and demand a 50% cut of their rare earth minerals?
Look, I think it's just a face saver. Okay, we know that they've sunk close to $500 billion perhaps into Ukraine, at least $350 billion. And Trump wants to give his people a face saver that, okay, we're going to end the war, but in return for all the money we have wasted on Ukraine, we're going to get a $500 billion deal so that we can take all of their rare earth minerals and we can use them for our purpose. So that's the kind of face saver Trump is looking for in Ukraine as a part of the ceasefire, that the US gets rights over Ukraine's rare earth reserves. So Zelensky was supposed to sign that agreement when he went to Washington, but it did not really work out that way. So now he's saying that he's willing to sign the agreement. Let's go back to the drawing board and we'll sign the agreement, and I'm willing to do that. But the alleged apology he put out is not really an apology. He has not taken the blame for what happened, for everything going on wrong. He said that what happened in Washington could have been managed better, which means that he's putting half the blame on the American side as well.
Sure.
So Zelensky is a big impediment right now on the road to peace. He doesn't want peace. He wants the war to go on. And the EU leaders also seem to want the war to go on. What Trump wanted was, he wanted to deal directly with Putin, decide on the terms of the ceasefire and get it done. But now these folks are coming in the way. So Trump is going to have to find a way to deal with them, which should not be too difficult and should not take too long.
The world is unfair in the way that they really start paying attention when it's white on white violence. Because both Russia and Ukraine, the people are white. It's such a historically significant, globally visible war where there are many other wars being fought in the world. And so no one likes white on white violence because people think, civilizationally we're doomed, we're going back. If white people who are supposedly democratic are fighting these wars. I will bring in our Sino friends here because this morning you shared a tweet from the foreign embassy in the US, and when I saw the tweet, I was very surprised. I almost never see aggressive statements from China, but I always see stealthy actions that are very aggressive, right?
Yes.
Making DeepSeek, punishing US in various ways, becoming a manufacturing hub, constantly featuring in graphs that show China's growth. They said if war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war or a trade war, or any type of war, we are ready to fight till the end.
That's what the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C., that's the tweet they put out today or last night for us.
Yeah.
And that's quite a statement. That's an unusually strong statement coming from the Chinese. That generally don't put that in writing, that sort of statement. So why is that happening? What's the deal? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. So what is the deal? We have to ask ourselves, who's the real net beneficiary, the biggest beneficiary of the Ukraine war? Look, we know that this is all happening in the context of the Ukraine war, the Chinese statement also. So who is the biggest net beneficiary of the Ukraine war? First of all, if a ceasefire happens today, tomorrow, whenever, Russia will retain all the territory it's won in Ukraine and so on. The US will get the mineral rights over Ukraine. So Russia and the US win, Ukraine loses, Ukraine is disposable, and the EU has no say in this. So the EU also loses. Their economies have been downgraded significantly because of the Ukraine war. Many of them have gone into recession. So EU is a loser, Ukraine is a loser, Russia and the US are win-win. India also has benefited from the Ukraine war, whether we like it or not, in terms of various things. We have got a tremendous amount of cheap energy from Russia. Our standing has risen in the world and so on. But what about China? China has stayed very quiet during this whole thing. But the biggest beneficiary could perhaps be China of the Ukraine conflict. First of all, Russia has become significantly dependent on China. There's this modus vivendi that can be almost called an alliance. That's currently the situation.
What's the word you use? Modus vivendi.
Modus vivendi.
I know modus operandi, but what's modus
Modus
vivendi?
vivendi. Modus vivendi means of way of living together.
Okay.
Way of coexisting.
Okay.
Kind of. Yeah. So there is that between Russia and China. China has benefited a lot from the Ukraine war, from all the energy flowing into China from Russia as well. The Middle East conflict has also destabilized the Middle East, but China has this 25-year strategic agreement with Iran, in which it gets a tremendous amount of Iranian energy for very cheap. And if you look at the overall geopolitical balance of power, China is in a very strong position. China has issues, no doubt, but it's economically very strong, and that's why the Americans are now going after China, and that's why they're putting tariffs, the trade and tariff war on China. They're also doing it against all other countries, including Canada and the EU nations and all.
Mexico, India itself.
We're
going to discuss India in a bit, yeah.
So India will deal with that. That's not going to be a problem. But China is going to face the brunt of the US pressure in terms of trade and tariffs. And that's the reason, because the Americans are imposing these tariffs on China. That's why the Chinese embassy has put out the statement that we are willing to fight to the end, whichever kind of war it is, whether it's trade, tariffs, or any other kind of war. And the Chinese are very confident in their military strength. They have been quietly building up their military strength like never before. They are churning out warships like you would churn out sausages. Okay, they have the biggest navy in the world in terms of numbers. They have at least two fifth generation fighter planes, two different kinds of fighter planes. They have a very modernized military. So they're quietly very confident. If you look at the number of shipbuilding yards the Chinese have, and you compare with the US, there's no comparison. The Americans have no shipbuilding yards. All of their ships are constructed somewhere else, maybe Korea or wherever it is. The Chinese have this tremendous capacity. They have the tremendous manufacturing capacity. So they are quietly extremely confident. And then they have this alliance with Russia and with other key nations. They are part of BRICS, and they are trying to tone down the tensions with India also, which is kind of succeeding the past year or so. So the Chinese are doing all the right things very quietly. India was a big problem because of what the Chinese did in 2020 Galwan. So now they have brought that tension down. The situation along the India-Tibet border is much more peaceful than it was the past 3, 4, 5 years. So the Chinese are quietly confident that they can take on the US, whether it's a trade war, whether it's a tariff war, or any other kind of war.
Wouldn't Putin not side with the US with the temptation of being with a bigger power than China? Would he not be tempted?
Great question. So let's understand the world from Putin's perspective. He has this giant country, and it's been really battered by American sanctions, but it's been able to withstand them because it is an autarky. It has all the resources any country could ask for. It doesn't need to import any raw materials from anywhere else. Whether it's coal, it's minerals, it's iron, it's oil, gas, whatever, fertilizers, agricultural products, everything they have. So they don't depend on anyone. That's a great plus they have. They have this huge geography as well. Now let's say Putin aligns with the US. What does he get out of it? The US won't allow him to take over Western Europe. It's out of the question. The Americans have already taken over the Panama Canal. It was sold to BlackRock just a couple of days ago.
It was?
Yes, it was. So they have taken over the Panama Canal without the US actually going and putting boots on the ground. But it's in the hands of the US now. Greenland will be done soon. See.
But today, the Prime Minister or the President of Greenland, his name is Mutate, just put out a statement saying Greenland is neither Danish nor something, not American, it's Greenlandic. That's the
words. I'll tell you how it's done. Okay, let me tell you how it will be done. See, Greenland's population is about 40,000.
What?
40,000. And it's a Danish territory. Now, what Trump will do is he will arm twist the Danish government in allowing a referendum in Greenland. Whether we want to be part of Greenland, we want to be independent, or whether we want to be part of the US. Okay, that's sort of referendum. So this referendum will happen sooner or later. Now, Greenland has a population of 40,000 roughly. You give each of them $1 million.
That's so easy.
That's what, 40 billion? That's nothing.
Just in India, if people want to win elections or like just, they just sometimes distribute money or alcohol.
What is it called? Revdi, right?
Yeah, like Revdi, Gajak Revdi. Yeah, it's like, I think what's fascinating is 40,000 people are very easy to arm, to bribe.
Give each of them $1 million. They're set for life. That's it. That's all it will take. Greenland is a fait accompli. It's done. It's a done deal.
But,
What does the US gain by taking over Greenland? It pushes Russia out of another part of the Arctic region. It also pushes China out of that part of the Arctic. And the US will have a proper military presence here. So they're actually pushing Russia away. They're pushing China away. Now, if Putin aligns with the US, he actually gets pushed out of this because the US is already doing this matter. They are in control of all the choke points of the world. The Panama Canal they control. They have a presence in the Indian Ocean region from Diego Garcia. They have Guam.
From who?
Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is this. It's part of the Lakshadweep Maldives underwater ridge. It's a mountain range of which some of the tops, mountain peaks, are islands. Lakshadweep Islands, Maldives Islands, and there is this archipelago south of the Maldives, which is called the Chagos Archipelago.
Okay.
And the British owned it until recently, and they have given the Americans the largest island over there, which is called Diego Garcia.
We can't buy it from them.
They won't allow us to. Actually, it should be ours, but that's a different story. So this island is home to a massive American air base and naval base. It can accommodate aircraft carriers, American aircraft carriers, and it can accommodate the heaviest of the long-range bombers that the Americans have.
Is it considered international waters or is it proper US territories?
It's UK territory. But now they are in the process of transferring sovereignty back to Mauritius because they stole it from Mauritius. But Diego Garcia will remain American for the next 99 years at least. So yeah, you could say it's American waters. Okay, so from there they can project power across the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, the Hormuz Strait of Hormuz, the Malacca Strait, and so on. So the Americans have control over major choke points, most of the major choke points in the world. The Russians don't have it, even the Chinese don't have it. So if Putin aligns with the US, he doesn't really get much. All he gets is this victory in Ukraine and the assurance that and a regime change in Ukraine, which he will ensure happens. But beyond that, he doesn't get much. But if he aligns with China, then he gets access to all everything the Chinese have. For example, their entire manufacturing industry, access to whatever agreements the Chinese have with various nations, all of that goes on. So it makes much more sense for Putin to align with China and hopefully with India rather than align with the US. Because the US it perceives Russia as an enemy. It will never perceive Russia as a friend. Temporarily, they'll talk nice to you, but eventually it's going to go back to the default situation.
Sure. Why do historically have China and Russia ever been at conflict with each other?
So historically, if you go back the past 1,000 years, Russia begins 1,000 years ago, more or less. If you go back to the 18th, 19th century, not much. That was the period of Russian eastward expansion. They started taking over parts of Siberia. Eventually, they took over the whole of Siberia and even Alaska, and eventually sold Alaska to the US. And they took over Siberia because there was no imperial presence of any kind there. There were the local native people who they just conquered.
Sure.
Okay. Now, has there been conflict between China and Russia? Yes. If you go back to 1969, there was this major border clash between China and Russia in the far east of Russia in Chinese Manchuria. And that incident is called the Ussuri River Clash, in which hundreds of soldiers on both sides died in a major military incident because of differing perceptions of the border. Okay, same thing that we've had with the Chinese between India and China. So major military clash, and the border dispute remained open until the 2000s. It was eventually dealt with, and recently, the past couple of years, the Chinese have again put out maps in which Russian places are named with Chinese names and so on. So the Chinese are putting that pressure on Russia, and the two nations in 1969 nearly went to war. The Kremlin had decided to nuke China in 1969 the Americans intervened and threatened the Russians, the Soviets, that if you nuke China, we're going to fight you. We're going to nuke you. And the Americans saved China. And then you had the famous Kissinger-Nixon Mao détente, and China becomes part of the US manufacturing machine. And unwittingly, the Americans aid and abet and midwife the rise of China.
And as they always do.
As they always do. So the Chinese and the Russians, they are two very large and powerful nations. The second and third most powerful nations in the world, and they have a very long border. When you have that situation, the two nations are guaranteed to be long-term adversaries. Guaranteed to be long-term adversaries. But temporarily, there may be some kind of modus vivendi or something, the kind of thing that we have right now. Putin he will feel very insecure about this gigantic 1.4 billion population south of Siberia. The Chinese can just walk into Siberia and the Russians may not even know about it. There is already significant Chinese logging activity, lumber and all that, cutting of trees and all that in Siberia, which is allowed by the Russians. But the Chinese population is there already in Siberia. And the Chinese could just peacefully infiltrate and take over parts of Siberia like that. There is that. And it's also true that the Russians have Iskander missiles posted on the Chinese border, nuclear armed missiles. So it's not like they are friends. Okay, there is a healthy amount of mistrust and all that, which naturally happens between large powers, between powerful nations. So these are not long-term allies. These are long-term adversaries. That is something you can take in writing. It's guaranteed. It's just the nature of power. When you have two very large powers, very powerful nations with a long common border, there can never be long-term lasting peace.
Which brings us to our country, India. Now Piyush Goyal is currently in America trying to do trade talks after reciprocal tariffs have been. Well, they're going to be implemented by Trump on April 2nd. So China, Mexico and Canada have all said we will have counter-reciprocal tariffs. But India has stayed quiet.
Yeah.
If you look at the exports into America from India, they far outweigh the number of imports from America to India. Where do we stand in this tariff war? And then, well, actually, let's start with that, and then I will ask you about the EU's sudden interest in India.
Okay, let's talk about Trump and the tariffs first of all. Yes, Trump has been making these statements, very loud statements that India levies unjust tariffs on the US. He likes to speak about the case of the Harley Davidson motorcycles and all. The truth is this: if you look at the exports from the US into India, India does levy some tariffs, but more than 75% of these items, India levies 5% or less, which is negligible. It's only the remaining 25% where there's a scope for discussion and negotiation, right? So first of all, we have to understand that we are not a nation that unjustly levies taxes and tariffs on the Americans. Next, we cannot afford to go to have a tariff war with the US. We want the US on our side.
Yeah.
Okay. So if
our diaspora is practically controlling their technology and now substantial parts of their government.
We aren't controlling our diaspora. I would not say we are controlling it, but we are a part of it.
We're cohabitating in a cooperative manner.
Yeah, that sort of thing. We aren't calling the shots, but we have people in high positions who are employees. The CEO is an employee of the organization, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So we are not in a position to fight a trade or tariff war with the US. It's not to our advantage. So I would imagine that whatever demands Trump makes, we're gonna say yes, of course. Let's talk about this. Let's go to the negotiating table and let's work out a fair compromise.
Sure.
To every demand he makes, we're gonna say that, and then we will have to work out a fair compromise, which will make him happy and which will hopefully not be disadvantageous to us either. So the thing about Trump is that he's got this massive ego, and you've got to play on that. So if he wants a win, you have to give him a win, because the big picture is the big picture.
Right.
We need the US on our side. Let's make some compromise. Let's bring the prices on US bourbon whiskey lower. Who cares? Instead of 10,000 rupees, we'll make it 7,000 rupees. Whatever.
You see a Jim Beam in a bar. It's often displayed on the bar. I've rarely seen anyone actually buy a Jim Beam. If you were to choose whiskeys of all the varieties, you would have any Scottish whiskey, any German whiskey for that matter, you'd rarely pick a Jim Beam. I think he said don't tax the bourbon whiskeys.
It's okay. We will not tax them. It's okay. It doesn't matter. So we need to be on Trump's good side. We need that. And I don't think India is going to try and fight a tariff war with the Americans. So Mr. Piyush Goyal is already in Washington, D.C., and they're going to work it out. It may take a while, but at least as long as we are talking to the Americans and working out a compromise, everything will be fine. So I don't think this tariff issue is going to be a big thorn in the side of India-US relations. I think the next 4 years, the India-US relations will be excellent, perhaps the best they've ever been.
Why is that?
Because we have a lot of convergence of interests. There is divergence of interest, obviously. They have all this leverage against us, Pakistan, East and West Pakistan and all that, and various other issues. There is the issue of Manipur, the civil war in Burma, which is hurting us, which is hurting our population, and so many other things. But overall, we need the US on our side because of the China factor. The Chinese aren't playing nice, acting nice with India because they love us suddenly.
Right.
It's just because they are facing a lot of pressure from other parts of the world, especially the US. That's why it makes sense for them to have India not have an adversary relationship with India. For example, Trump is going to dump all kinds of tariffs on Chinese goods.
Right.
Okay. So, and the EU will also do that. He's going to force the EU to do that also. Let's say let's assume that he succeeds in doing that. Then what happens is that the US market, the world's biggest market, and the EU market are no longer profitable for Chinese manufacturing exports. So what's left for them? Russia isn't that big of a market. Africa is a non-existent market. What's left is India, 1.4 billion people. So they need access to the Indian market, and that's why they are playing nice right now. But the Chinese military might is tremendous. Okay, it's untested, but it's still theoretically on paper much greater than India's military might. China's hard power is about 3 to 4 times more than that of India. So if there's a war between India and China, if it's a Himalayan war, we may come out on top, but a long-term sustained war, we will not be able to withstand the Chinese onslaught. So we need the US on our side. So we need to figure somewhere in the US calculations, and we figure to a very large extent in the US geopolitical calculations in the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region. So we need the Americans on our side, and that's why we will not go against Trump in his crusade to have India lower tariffs on them.
And what about the EU's sudden interest in India, where Prime Minister Modi also met with the head of the EU?
Yeah.
Today, the head of, I think, Space and Defense, the Space and Defense head of the EU also said India is a great nation for us to ally with, something along those lines. Now, generally, I don't see the EU doing too many bilateral talks in this part of the world. Right? It's largely reserved to its own area and the US and everything westward. I found that fascinating. Why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, things are changing. So right now there is this friction between the EU and Trump. None of the EU leaders, bureaucrats, like Trump. Okay, because he is not treating them right. He's not treating them like the royalty, like they're accustomed to being treated like. So the EU is looking for options. The EU wants to show that it's independent of the US and so on. So that's why Madame Ursula von der Leyen came to India. She met with Prime Minister Modi. And for us, we have no objection to that. We're going to play nice with Trump. We'll also play nice with the EU. So if there is a trade deal or a free trade agreement or whatever between the EU and India, it's great for us. It's very advantageous for us. We have lots of things to export to the EU. We are now emerging as a significant defense exporter. We have the world's best missiles. I kid you not. We have some of the best missiles in the world, best anti-aircraft missiles, very scary missiles we have. We have the Pinaka system. We have various arms manufacturers, howitzer manufacturers. There's a lot that we can export to the EU, and a lot of the EU countries are now thinking about militarizing because the situation is changing, and they can no longer afford to remain welfare states.
Will the US allow as a layman, I've never heard of a country that is of significant might globally using an Indian defense product. So for example, we use tons of Russian, French, American missiles and aircraft.
Yes.
Is it possible that a Spain will use an Indian missile? And will the US allow that?
So yeah, it's pretty strange that India is talking about exporting arms and ammunition. Historically, we have always been a net importer. Not a net importer, we imported almost everything, right? Of late, we are becoming a manufacturing power in certain sectors in the defense industry. For example, Armenia. For the case of Armenia, there's this war, the situation going on between Armenia and Turkey-Azerbaijan, and these two nations want Armenia to be wiped off the map of the world. And India is supporting, is supplying Armenia with Pinaka rocket systems, multi-barrel rocket systems, Swati radars, and various other arms and ammunition. And we are supplying it through Iran. Okay, so through a Muslim country, we are supplying a Christian country with this high quality of weaponry, and it's very good. We are supplying certain nations in Southeast Asia with BrahMos missiles and so on. We have a very good fighter plane, which sadly lacks Indian jet engines, which is the Tejas. But once we sort that out, it'll be a good thing. So we are slowly becoming a defense or recognized defense manufacturer. And there's a lot of Indian equipment that is very high quality. And various European nations would not mind buying it, especially since it is not that highly priced.
To my surprise, I went to go see an arms dealer in Batala, Amritsar, for a podcast. A young gentleman, second generation. This was during election time in Punjab. So they had their shutter half open, and people would come in and deposit their guns. And I was just sitting there. This gentleman wielded an Adani gun in front of me. A silver gun. I forget what it's called. It was a beautiful handgun to look at. To me, I think of Indian business houses as primarily services, coal, falan, dimkana. It's surprising to wrap your head around that Indian business giants are now making guns.
Indeed. High quality small arms.
Yeah, no, it was a beautiful gun. He was all praised for it.
Yeah, so we are seeing this shift happening now. There's a lot of good stuff that's being manufactured in India. Lots of armored personal carriers, small and medium arms, machine guns, automatic rifles of various kinds, various bores and stuff. A lot.
Do you ever study the implications of wars and geopolitical expansion and contraction in relation to financial markets?
Yes.
I ask this because one can go look at their portfolios in mutual funds and stocks, and you can read the news and say that Sensex is an all-time low, Nifty is doing pretty badly. Across the world, the Trumpification of everything is being felt. Now, what do you think is the future, the financial future of all of this geopolitical intrigue? Because it's been heightened. The last time we spoke about isolated incidents in some part of the world. Now with America having such a big loudspeaker president and his policies being heard and visibly upsetting so many people, there is an implication on the finances of the world.
Yeah, the financial system of the world is pretty interesting right now. It's obviously, as we know, it's all dependent on the US dollar, which is the backbone of the global economic order. It's the reserve currency. And there's been talk in recent times of de-dollarization. I assure you it's not happening anytime soon. Trump will not let that happen. As long as Trump's in power, the next 4 years, we're not going to see that. There are moves in various countries to kind of move away from the US dollar. But any idea of a BRICS currency, for example, is very premature. What will most likely happen is that nations will trade bilaterally in their currencies. So ruble trade, rupee yuan trade, ruble yuan and yuan dirham trade and that sort of thing. I don't think anybody is going to diversify completely away from the US dollar. The US dollar will remain the backbone of the global economic order. The US, obviously, we know that it's got this gigantic debt, but it's something they can just print their way out of, but that would destroy the world economy because of inflation. So now Trump has come up with this genius plan of issuing this golden, they used to have the green card, right? So now it's going to be rebranded as a Trump gold card. Earlier, you had to invest between $500,000 to $1 million to get a green card.
Right.
Now it's going to be $5 million. And it's going to come with a whole host of additional benefits. So if they can get, let's say, 5 million people to buy this, they will be able to easily pay off their entire debt, national debt. So that's one way of leveraging the kind of country you have and acquiring global talent and money as well. So that's going to happen. But overall, the global economy, you could perhaps see it. You've had the global rules-based world order, everything based on the US dollar. You may see a bipolar world in the future. One block will be Russia, China, Iran, and various nations aligned with them who will try and establish a different system, maybe break out of SWIFT, which is the system that underwrites the whole global financial transactions. They may break away from that. But there is also the temptation from Russia, once Trump eases down on the sanctions, to reintegrate itself with the Western economy. That's also going to be a thing. So I don't think there's going to be a significant shift in the world economy. There's going to be economic wars. Trump is going to apply tariffs wherever needed, Canada, Mexico, wherever. But overall, I don't see too much changing, apart from many nations will place bets on gold now. If you may have seen this, the past month or two, a lot of nations have been withdrawing gold from the Bank of London.
Correct.
It used to be a repository for gold for many nations. India withdrew a lot of gold from there. The Americans apparently are taking out all the gold. So the UK may suffer may take a hit because of that. It may no longer be a premium destination for the world's gold. So a lot is changing right now. So eventually, I imagine the world will become bipolar. The US on one side and whoever is with that, and on the other side, Russia, China plus whoever. And I imagine India will be somewhere in between because we want to be friends with everybody.
Right, that's I think we're very likable like that. I was reading something around pre-World War I, the USA focused on something called balanced offshoring, offshore balancing. And China is the real threat to the USA. And then I suddenly realized that Zelensky said something, perhaps in his ignorance, during that infamous Oval Office meeting that we were just discussing, that you have these great big oceans, you don't feel the tremors of the war, but eventually you will. Now, you mentioned that the US holds choke points. Are we going to see some geopolitical expansion in the world's oceans as well as time goes on?
The world's oceans are prowling with predators like submarines and all that. So, Zelensky made this a very intriguing remark that you feel safe because you've got the oceans on your side, on both sides, but it will not remain the same that way forever, and you'll soon feel something different. And that is obviously something that sounds like a threat, and it really annoyed Trump in advance. The US has this great advantage. It's isolated from the rest of the world on two sides by gigantic oceans. The Atlantic,
it's a big island country.
It's like an island continent.
Right. And
they essentially own Canada and also control Mexico and so on, and South America as well because of the historic Monroe Doctrine situation and all that.
What's the Monroe Doctrine?
The Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine in the 19th century which the US put out, and it said that the US would no longer tolerate outside interference in South America, outside of the Americas, which means that it would no longer tolerate European attempts to control South America. And
linguistically, Spain controls all of South America, if you think about it.
Yeah, linguistically, that's the only connection they have left now. They have no real influence left in South America beyond cultural influence. No hard influence, no geopolitical, military or economic influence at all. The US controls the two continents, North and South America and Central America as well. So the US has had this. And in the Second World War, the Nazis tried to send submarines, U-boats, all the way to the Americas. And they did hit some shipping and all that in the Americas across the Atlantic. And the Japanese also posed a significant threat to the Americans. And there was this Battle of San Francisco, which may have been Japanese, may have been aliens, who knows, that happened during the Second World War era. So, today, the world is at a different place technologically. Today, you have technologies like autonomous underwater vehicles, which you can think of as autonomous drones that operate underwater. It's like mini submarines that can carry whatever payload or whatever weaponry you want, and it can operate underwater for months at a time autonomously, or in drones, or in swarms, like schools of fish, but schools of autonomous robots that operate underwater. So the threshold, the barrier to attacking a nation like the US from the ocean is much lower now. So it's possible. And the Chinese are big on this technology, drone technology, underwater vehicle technology, and so on. And they may have weaponry that they have obviously would not have revealed to the world. And that's why the Americans are very wary about China. So yeah, that situation may arise in the future, where the US may be in a situation where it will feel a genuine threat of being attacked from the oceans.
One last thing before we end. Last time, I remember us discussing why India was not an expansionist power. Why did we not buy land, right? Why did we, Sri Lankans might be upset at this, or Bangladeshis or Pakistanis. Like the same way as the US attempts to buy Greenland and attempts to mock Trudeau by calling him Governor Trudeau, right? One way to acquire might is to literally just buy land, right? And expand like this. We didn't do that as a country. Will Trump's open defiance of these nations and their neighbor Canada and the attempt to buy them also lead to other countries now buying geographies all around, including India?
Interesting question. So then, first of all, historically, let's look at this historically. It is alleged that India has not invaded any other country for the past 2,000 years, which is the complete fabrication.
Right.
We've had empires that have expanded all over the place. The Kushan emperors of our emperors, for example, Kanishka, his career was a military career. He conquered, his empire touched the shores of the Caspian Sea and the Aral Sea, and it included much of present-day Tibet and Xinjiang.
So Caspian Sea is present-day
between
Central Europe?
Between Russia and Iran. That's
Okay.
sea. And the Aral Sea, which is more or less dried out now, but a huge empire. That's the example of Kanishka. Various Gupta emperors also conquered parts of Afghanistan and Central Asia. Then you have the Cholas, who had an empire stretching all the way to the Philippines. So it's not true that we have not been an expansionist civilization. We have had emperors who did that in the past. When it comes to Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that's part of the subcontinent, so we don't talk about that. We talk about beyond the subcontinent. So historically, we've had emperors who behaved in that fashion a few times. Now, talking about today, yeah, Trump is in the process of acquiring territories, either overtly or covertly. For example, if the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal is sold to BlackRock, it becomes a US acquisition.
Sure.
Greenland, they may take over soon, and we'll see what Mexico, Canada, we'll see. So the rules, the old rules have been thrown out of the door. The so-called rules-based world order, you can't do certain things and all that, that's gone now. Okay, he's going to teach the world what hard power geopolitics is all about. So does it mean that India and other nations can also do the same thing? The rule is this: if you can, you do. If you can't, you shut up. That's how it is. It's interesting to see India's position in the world's geography. We occupy a God-gifted position geographically. The subcontinent juts all the way down into the Indian Ocean, almost to the equator. We dominate the Indian Ocean region like no other nation
We're
can.
not a landlocked country either.
Yeah, there is that. But historically, we have been a maritime civilization. So if we had developed a powerful navy, we would have been almost superpower today. We haven't done that. So first of all, there is that. Now, if you look at the Indian subcontinent and see all the little nations, there's East and West Pakistan, there is Nepal, there is Bhutan, there is Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Afghanistan. These are the subcontinental nations, right? You see that they are all proxies of somebody or the other, except for India. East and West Pakistan are US proxies. Bangladesh. Okay, apologies to our Bangladeshi viewers. Okay, then Nepal is split somewhere between the US and China. Okay.
No, India doesn't have access to Nepal like it used to.
No, we still have friendly relations with Nepal. We still can, Indian citizens and Nepali citizens can cross the border without any documentation. All that stuff is there. But so civilizationally, culturally, ethnically, we are the same people, but there is political friction between India and Nepal. So the Nepalese politicians are mostly aligned with China, and it is a virtue for them to abuse India. That sort of thing. When it comes to Sri Lanka, also because of various things.
So basically, their pockets have been lined with far more money by China, as opposed to by India, who sort of refuses to pay as much. I'm assuming.
That's a whole story behind that. I will not go into that, but that's the situation. Even the Americans have influence in Nepal, let's say. Okay, when it comes to Afghanistan,
Sorry, one more thing.
Yeah.
Isn't it said about Kathmandu that all the world's spies at one point, you could find them in Kathmandu's cafes and bars?
Cafes, bars, and casinos.
Yeah.
Yeah. True. Then moving to Afghanistan, it is alleged by very reliable sources that the Taliban receives between $40 to $100 million in cash as a stipend weekly from the US, which means it's a US asset. Okay, they're friendly with us, but they're a US asset. Sri Lanka, you could say it's a World Bank asset. Yeah, let's just say it that way. Okay, then you have the Maldives.
Yeah. By the way, I was in Colombo for a wedding.
Okay.
Spoke to I'm doing some very hotel guest journalism, which is not trustable at all, right? Because you're just seeing the world from the 5-star resort. But a few people were very they were very admirable. They showed great admiration for China.
Okay.
And I saw some projects was directly invested by China around my hotel.
So the Chinese had a significant amount of sway over Sri Lanka for a long time, especially when Mahinda Rajapaksa was in power. They built various ports and things like Hambantota Port and airport, which nobody uses today, White Elephant projects. But the Chinese tried their best to woo Sri Lanka and make Sri Lanka a Chinese asset. And it worked for a long time. Today, you can say it's you have the economic situation there to be bailed out by India and other World Bank and other organizations, IMF possibly. So you could say it's kind of a soft US asset today, Sri Lanka. Then you have the Maldives, which has been a Chinese asset for quite some time. So if you look at the subcontinent, except for Bhutan, every nation around India, our historical territories, they're all proxies of somebody else. Okay? And this is not a bad thing. It tells you that India is that powerful that everybody sees the need to have proxies around India to have leverage over India. So my point is this: the day India will turn all the subcontinent nations into our own proxies, that's the day we'll be a great power. Right? And you don't need to physically control a nation for that. You just need to have control over their politics and so on by various means. That's how you turn nations into vassals.
Yeah, so would you say that our deep state operations aren't that advanced yet, where we have decided to follow the US line of thought and start appointing our own puppet rulers? We're not there yet, you're saying?
So the efficacy of your deep state operations is a direct function of how powerful you are as a nation, which is economic and military power. If you don't have the economic power, you can't buy puppets. Obviously, you have to buy them, right? You have to bribe them naturally. That's how the world works. Sam, dam, dandabhed, Chanakya. You use every rule in the book. So you have to be very powerful economically to buy assets and keep them bought for a long period of time. Secondly, you also need military power to remind them that if the economic power doesn't work, we have the military power to back our words up.
Right.
So right now, we are not there economically or militarily. We are strong enough to defend ourselves from anybody. We have the deterrent, the big red button and so on. So nobody will be able to conquer us or try to invade us. We have the last resort, the nuclear option. But we aren't powerful enough to... So if you look at the balance of power, the top three powers, first of all, you have the US, number one. Number two, you could say is Russia. And number three is China, which is paradoxical because China has a bigger economy, but Russia has a gigantic nuclear deterrent, which...
Sorry, a nuclear deterrent is something that deters others from nuking you.
Yes, it's the size of your nuclear arsenal and the means to deliver the gift.
Okay.
So the Russians have probably the most powerful nuclear deterrent in the world, definitely the largest number of nuclear warheads, and they have missiles that can deliver them anywhere in the world. And missiles that have MIRVs and MARVs and stuff like that, which is the stuff of nightmares. So nobody will dare mess with Russia. We have a reasonably sizable nuclear deterrent, and we have the means to deliver it wherever we want in the world, including from submarines and all that. So that ensures that our safety is guaranteed. But we still don't have the power to make other countries our puppets. And you don't need to destroy a country or to victimize it if you make it a puppet. You can make it prosperous if you want. So the top three powers in the world are the US, number one, the Russia, number two, and number three is China. And India is number four. And India is, Russia is about half as strong as the US. China is about a third as strong as Russia. and India is about a third as strong as China. So that's how far down we are. So once we reach China's level, for example, hopefully by 2040, 2050, then you could see a very different subcontinent. So we have to work hard to reach that state right now. That status, that amount of power. We don't have it right now.
So probably the children of my children will come and inherit a different India.
Hopefully our children.
Yeah. Let's hope. Well, once again, thank you for your time. It's always been a pleasure to speak with you about these things. Good primer on whatever is happening in the world geopolitically. I think the way things are and how dynamic and erratic Trump is in his style of politics and his style of policy, there's going to be many, many tremors felt in the world, and we're going to have you back on again to describe it for those of us who don't read, OSINT or whatever geopolitical. I think what you do always is a service in unpacking very complicated ideas, policies, geopolitical intrigue, and all of that. And wish you the best. People can follow you on Abhijit Chavda. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Did you enjoy the podcast? Head over to Dostcast on Spotify for more unreleased episodes and the best of Dostcast. Link in description.